So, the slow movement of the second Beethoven sonata is incredible, predictable and surprising, especially in hindsight, obviously, as we are today compared to his time, early 19th century. Vienna, and not any Vienna, Haydn's Vienna, the inventor of the sonata form, at least, as we were told. And it turns out that the slow movement is written for string quartet. Oh, it's a piano sonata, okay. But the genre, the style, you have a chorale of 3 parts with the staccato, pizzicato of the cello. I mean, obviously he writes through the sonatas, meaning through the piano sonatas, imaginary string quartets, orchestra symphonies, opera arias. And that is beautiful, even if the decade time of the fortepianos of Beethoven's time was very short compared to today. So slow tempi couldn't hold the values of the resonance long enough to be singing in stretched chorale singing, as he writes, specifically tenuto, and then the left hand bottom part staccato, or pizzicato if it imitates the cello, which it does. And largo, which is even slower than adagio, according to the Melzel metronome, which was just to be marketed in Vienna then, but not yet currently used, let less this objective time pulse beats a minute that will define the tempo objectively compared to the mood of the timing. So you have adagio at ease, andante walking, allegro, of course, moderato, moderate in between, allegro lively. Then, of course, you go up with the presto, with the rushed, excited, and vivace, of course, lively also. But if you go lower, you go into largo and grave for gravity and grave, or deep. So they insist on this Italian usage because of the operatic terms used for rehearsing operas, the Italianate opera, which was in fashion in Vienna then with Salieri, who was the court composer of Italian operas, being Italian himself. And the Italian rehearsals of operas, opera meaning work in Italian, were all used with Italian words. So when Melzel marketed the metronome in Vienna, he used the Italian denominations for the listing of the tempi, that the weight that would slide on the pendulum of the mechanical metronome would be in front of. So that's how largo is under, or therefore slower than adagio, which is slower than andante, etc. But even if all of that is the case, it's the piece itself that talks, in the music, the texture, the singing, the direction of the line, the phrasing, the legato, the length of the sounds, the resonance of the pizzicato, staccato, the air between the notes in the beats, like steps of some kind of slow procession that it evokes through the piano. In fact, the piano is not an instrument for which they wrote. I think literally they used the piano to evoke all other genres, other instruments, other groupments. Perhaps because it's transportable and at the same time, in a certain way, being evocative of the others. It doesn't need the others, in fact. It's like a transcription. You don't have to breathe for the voice, so you don't have to worry about the tempo being too slow if you can sustain longer sounds. But then does it mean that an andante is the same when you play with a violinist in a bow length, or a singer who needs to breathe and cannot breathe in the middle of a word? Therefore, inevitably, the tempo is a choice by a limitation of the production of the instrumental sound. It would be wind and singing for the air column, or would it be the length of bow for the string players? But pianists have naturally, especially when they play alone, no need to think about that, because they don't breathe and they don't produce any sound according to a bow length. So inevitably they have to phrase, breathe by assumption and by unnecessity, but by musical agogic punctuation necessity. So it's almost like today's electric cars, for whatever this analogy is worth, where they add electric sound so that it's not softly or silently, totally so that the passengers, I mean the people who pass, can hear the car and not get hit if they don't see it. So it seems to me like the piano doesn't need to breathe, doesn't need a bow, but we need to stroke it like a bow for the phrasing, and we need to breathe like the singers or the wind players for the phrasing of the melodic line, the arching, the breathing, the eventual reaching of the climax, if any. It's interesting because younger Beethoven took some classes with Haydn, or so we know, and it didn't go very well, we understand. I don't think he was the perfect student. I don't think he really wanted to learn. He was always very thick-headed and very full of his own opinions. And I'm sure that he must have found that the assignments of Haydn were perhaps too restraining for his possibly very, it was already young as he was, very strong creativity. I guess he was a rambunctious genius. Whenever Mozart was the natural heir of Haydn, there's two different ways of inheriting um, a tradition. It's an interesting anecdote that I was reading about, that when Beethoven was brought in by his student Czerny to attend at his old age a recital of Child Liszt at the time in Vienna, child prodigy naturally, and Liszt himself living to a certain old age for the 19th century in his 70s, was telling a student of his that when he was a child, he remembers Beethoven coming on stage after the performance, kissing him on the forehead and telling him something. And when the student asked him, "What did he ask you, maestro?" or "What did he tell you, maestro?" he said, "He told me, keep doing what you like. I never learned anything from Haydn." That's a very strange thing to say to a child after a concert. Perhaps it was out of context, or perhaps Liszt edited the context in telling it to his student 60 years, 70 years later. Okay, who knows? But the point is, it's true. Beethoven took and learned, as he would, should, and did early, the Haydn rules, or the sonata form, for instance. But then he did everything through his career as a composer to demolish all these rules in order to do his own expression first within the form, and then breaking the form to create an osmosis with his own language. Sforzandi on the strong beats, but then they became Sforzandi on the weak beats, provocative, unexpected, expressive, personal, and then the forms changed. He added fugues to sonatas or theme and variations instead of scherzi and rondos, and he did two movement sonatas. In fact, they were becoming fantasies in the pure sense of the fact that they were not in the formal acception of the term sonata compared to cantata, which was to sing, sonata to sound, to be heard. To a certain point, I think that Beethoven's advice to Liszt was relatively healthy, though bold. And how much a 10-year-old Liszt would have understood about it, how much did Liszt know at age 10 who Haydn was? At that time, Haydn was dead for 11 years, if it's chronologically correct, all that. And did he really grasp the meaning of what he told him, or did he take time through his life to reconstruct what Beethoven told him that he might have made no sense on the spot? I only know very humbly that it happened to me in a way very similarly because of the sound of the words and the not knowledge, the no knowledge of the name that was quoted. When I was 10, I wrote a concerto for piano and orchestra, and Mademoiselle Boulanger sent in for Yehudi Menuhin to conduct it with a chamber orchestra. First rehearsal, Mr. Menuhin comes to me. I give him my hand and honor him by bowing. And he tells me in French, because we were in Paris, he says, Je suis ici parce qu'Enesco. And I didn't compute what he said because we were there to rehearse, and I was so much more, if not nervous because I wasn't, but driven and focused on the rehearsal to come, to hear my piece come to life. My first time with orchestra. So I didn't think more about it, except that somehow my subconscious recorded that strange sentence phonetically, so to say. So I did, years later, rethink about this sentence. And at that time, I had studied more and learned more and understood more about people in the music world. And Menuhin was a child prodigy himself in Paris, probably half a century earlier. And Enesco was this Romanian conductor and, of course, virtuoso violinist, but also student of composition of Gabrielle Fauré. When my teacher, young girl that she was then, was also a student of Fauré, and Ravel, young man, was also. And there is a phenomenal recording that I had heard of Menuhin playing the Mendelssohn violin concerto with an orchestra in Paris when he was a child, conducted by Ionesco, the Romanian violinist, composer, and Fauré student. And so when he came to me, therefore, from my concerto, he said to me, I'm here because of Enesco. Je suis ici parce qu'Enesco. But I heard Kenesco, and I didn't even know the name, let less the liaison of the word, Kenesco. So when I deciphered it, I understood that he made an analogy about the fact that he comes to conduct me at age 10 because Enesco came to conduct him at age 10. So he didn't have to tell me. I don't know why he told me that, because probably he knew I wouldn't understand a word of the analogy in the sentence unless he took time to explain it, which he didn't, and which I took time to, with time, to understand, because I was curious to reconstruct the meaning of the sentence. Therefore, who knows? In all humility, probably Liszt also was thinking later, why did he tell me this about Haydn? Being a teacher, I couldn't agree very much. Perhaps the truth is that, yes, you go to study with a teacher to learn something that is perhaps a trade, perhaps a technique, perhaps um, a way to express your art form that needs some of the information, but most of the rest you do intuitively. And if you have to learn how to play music counterintuitively with the expression of the construction of the line and the way the music is expressed that doesn't correspond to the tension release of the musical intuition that you get into it, then you project yourself in an arched phrase further. So at this point you lose the intuition, therefore the spontaneity, and you switch to a knowledgeable way to construct your phrase. Now, the question is, if you put them next to each other, which is more valuable, which is more telling, which is more honest, or at least more spontaneous and more real, representing you? What you learned in your recite, or you studied and you reproduce, or the book says, or the recording says, or the teacher said, or how much of that becomes you in your expression of the piece? That doesn't have to be contradictory with what you are told, or you learned, or discovered about the piece, because you might have felt it without to read it. And you can learn music and play it by ear like mother tongue, and then when you look at the score, you discover details of intentions or intents, things about articulations, inner voices, details, subtleties. And then all these details might, while right, legitimate, I think they might throw you off from your natural way of expressing it. Of course, if you sing or you play any melodic instrument, it's all more into the production of the intonation and the vibrato and the quality of both and the exactitude of all. But when you play a polyphonic instrument that is relatively mechanical to play, because you don't touch the sound production, you don't touch the string, you don't touch the production of the vibrato itself of the string, then you think more intellectually in a way. You construct it more like with a GPS in mind. Then the form becomes the GPS, and then the restatement becomes the conclusive repetitivity, which brings sense and makes you understand where you were in the form. This is my first theme, which developed like this, appears in the left hand, appears in the right hand. So perhaps you have to at some point reach the point of knowledge, understanding analytically of the language, the style, the formal, the textual, the contextual, and then still manage to put it aside in order to play the melodic flow of the expression of the sentence. Perhaps that's difficult to know. At which point is too late, at which point is too early to forget, and at which point is too late to retrieve the initial drive or marvelment or enthused spontaneity which brought you in the first place to play the piece, let less its complexity. But you didn't go for the complexity, you went for the melody or the harmony, or perhaps you don't even know what, just a general feel, atmospheric. Oh, it feels so good to be in this movement. I don't want to know why, and if I know too much, will I be able to reconnect with it so naturally that I sound like I just met it? It's a philosophical fact of teaching. How to balance the detail with the whole, the learned with the intuitive. Does it mean that you reject your learning or your teacher? Hopefully not. Being a teacher, I don't plead against my own. And it doesn't have to be through a breaking point. It could be just more smoothly. You can say, well, I keep this from this and I take away that, and perhaps this way I can say, but there are things, but I'm not sure I'll keep everything. Perhaps it's more honest. It's not like a recipient that you fill up by emptying on the other side and you say, now you're ready. I think it's more about ingredients that take time to blossom on their own. Sometimes they take their own time despite of your will, despite of your desire to be ready, because I want to play it, I want to record it, I have to play this competition, I have to play this jury, this audition, this position. You're always obliged to be ready before you're ready. You have to deliver before you have matured. You have to deliver before you have really mastered the technique to present your artistry. And artistry without technique is anyway limping. But technique without artistry can be quite impressive, even if empty as a substance. So by the time you fill up the substance, you define the quality of the refined technique that is required for this specific piece in this specific type of things, in our repeated notes, melodic repeated notes, voicing, secondary voicing, trill, combination of all of the above, rhythmic patterns, articulations that are layered over each other and not blending. Too many details that you think, in fact, people don't hear, but they do. Even if they don't know that they do, or they can't name it, they realize that it's refined and or is raw. So it's an impatient patience that is required of every student. I mean, it is always longer than we hope, and we never feel like we reach the destination. The destiny, that's another story, but the destination at least. I try to be very encouraging as a teacher, as well as on long term, putting in perspective for the student, saying it will take you 2 or 3 or 4 revisitations of the piece in order to be able to express more of the elements that live in you when you play it, for you to become the vibrant membrane that translates it directly from the intent of the composer to the psyche of the listener. All this is easy to say and so difficult to do. It takes time. It really does. Sometimes it's frustrating that it takes so much time. I don't want to discourage them by telling them it will be 20 years, because that's also arbitrary. It could be 12 months. Perhaps it will be, I don't know. In fact, I really don't know. Meaning, I think everybody matures differently, different times, and connecting so many dots, even if they're delivered by some teacher who is respectfully helping you to get to that point and not just using you for their own satisfaction, it takes a lot of selflessness to be a real teacher, and accepting not to see the results happen in front of your eyes, ears, and okay, that's like everything. Seasons and blossoming of different seasons bring in different things. They don't need me to teach them why it's beautiful, why it's meaningful, and probably the way they love it, not the way I love it, but we love it. So therefore we serve it, and to serve it right, we have to go through the details: articulation, pedal, direction, nothing but the sentencing, the phrasing, the direction, the meaning we give to these sounds as if they were words. The transparency of some sections, some textures, everything is to be taken in account and then played through, not as a series of sections, but as a flow of a thought process, of a mind, of a, of an, in fact, of very intense emotional and intellectual reflections of the composer's thought. And I think that, as Mademoiselle Boulanger did so respectfully, teaching us music of composers whom she knew, Ravel, Poulenc, Debussy, Piazzolla, of course, being students, Copland, Lily Boulanger, her sister, and many others, while never using the tactics of the sharing anecdotic moments with famous people like that, because she philosophically, I think she was very convinced in that. She thought the works are sort of away from the performer. I mean, from the composer. They don't belong anymore to the composer. They are works on their own that we are to serve in a sort of universal musical appeal. So we were working on interpretation, analysis, understanding, performing of their pieces, but not compared to their characters or personalities. It's tempting when you knew them, but she refrained from using that as a way to catch up with us and say, oh, he did this when we did that, and he composed this when we went there. And I must say I would have loved that, actually, because it's a bit of a gossipy, and it's somehow fun to place the piece in a context of a life. It's not written outside of a human life, it's written within the human life. Of course, the process of creation of music is difficult to define and understand, even if we can analyze the consequences of it by the piece itself. But nevertheless, no, it was all about working on the works, on their works, on the form, the melodic, the harmonic, the modal, if it were, the different types of music language used to compose it. Um, it was a very strange thing because she never separated interpretation from, let's say, analysis or performance and learning about the piece. It was about somehow the interpretation comes naturally once you have absorbed all the elements that are constitutive of the piece. So if you could read it right, you could play it right. Of course, in order to play it right, you have to have a technique and fingering to play it right. So you try to apply that to find how to do that. But in order to do that, you have to first hear it or be taught how to listen to it, how to structure the phrase by how many bars if they are, or how many uneven rhythms if there were, and how many up and down beats if there are any, how many accentuations and how much to bring them or not. What is characteristic or not? Is it folkloric or intellectual or just an homage from another composer? There's so many layers to the innuendo between the notes of the thematic material, even if the melody can take our heart so emotionally, or the harmony can transport us in some other world, which is what harmonies usually do atmospherically. And then at the same time start with comparing it to pieces that we like from other composers, as if we necessarily need to. Sometimes it is just what it is, or sometimes even if it reminds us of another piece, we accept it. It's not per se a thief, perhaps a borrower. And after all, there is also serendipity of organizing some notes in some order. But we're not here to judge, we're here to understand, we're here to serve the piece, and we're here to bring the essence of what it carries. Of course, you have to learn certain traditions, you have to learn some lineages of the pieces, like Ravel's quartet, and you have to understand what Fauré was teaching, and the voice leadings and the Gregorian chants and the modality and the, let's say, factually the plagal cadences. So a lot of elements that come in mind when you hear the piece or discover the piece of somebody who you think is writing in the lineage of somebody else. Like Gabriel Dupont's music in the lineage of César Franck. And in between you have his teacher who was Charles-Marie Widor. And so, yes, you do learn about these things. You discover them. You marvel. You say, oh, how humble, or how exciting, or how daring for them to write some thematic material that reminds you or not, or is a deformation of another one. In a way, it becomes nevertheless their own. It's like a transcription sounds on its own, like not the echo or the copy of the original. I think if a composer reminds us of some other influences through his piece of composers, ultimately when we take the complete piece in account, we can say, okay, I can hear and sense and taste and feel a little bit of this, a little bit of that, perhaps a bit of Shostakovich, or I don't know, I just say a name randomly. But at the end, the produce, it's personal. It has ingredients of things that reminds us of this or that, but in fact, altogether, it creates its own mix, its own personality in music that is defined, definable, and personal. It's like parental connection. You cannot ignore or deny, just accept and develop. It's humble but important to do so, to think so, to organize so. or less slow, and this time I can hear perhaps more connected the melodic notes, even if it's largo, and still implement the pizzicato staccato in the cello part of the left hand's bottom part. So that was much more connected, but then it's so much more rushed. And when he wrote largo, he didn't write adagio, not even andante, and appassionato, of course. Why not? Largo appassionato. We associate usually the intensity of the appassionato with a faster tempo, but this is very slow, very stretched, very singing, very step-by-step walking in the pizzicato, some kind of very important, perhaps formal way of declaiming the text, like an oratorian would do in the ancient days of Rome or Greece, in the mythological days. While it's probably more a procession. And this would be the steps. And the chorale of violin 1, viola, and violin 2. And 3, and conductor would subdivide it in 6/8 notes, but then for the phrasing it has to be in slow 3 rather than faster 6, or both, a little bit of both. You have it in the walk or the step, and in the singing. All these are said easily, but done complicatedly. That's not the word. Probably subtly, that's preferable. What do you think? What you gain with the tempo, you lose with the articulation. What you gain with the details, you lose with the stretch of the whole direction of the line. Somewhere in between must be the truth. The decay of the length of the sound, the softly repeated, restricken, repeated notes. Of course, he wrote it for his fortepiano of the time, not the modern piano of today that could hold it without the need to restrike it. But we need to restrike it because it's in the score. And this is the original 1820s score of Beethoven's time, published in Vienna by the famous Artaria, who published the Mozart concerti and all. So he was a famous publisher, and the indications are very clear, though a little bit confusing sometimes because the engraving is relatively rudimentary compared to today's precision quality of printed text. But that was the one that was done then. That obviously must have been gone back and forth with Beethoven for double checking, correcting, or perhaps not. Perhaps Beethoven didn't have time, didn't care, or he did. And to a certain extent, no matter how much they corresponded and tried to improve until it becomes the real reflection of the intent of the composer. Daily life being as it is, probably they just went on to the next thing. And perhaps today, for sure, I'm not perhaps, for sure, today's musicologists and music scholars and publisher editors have way more time to explore the source materials and the differences between the editions between then and now, and the explanation and the understanding, the misunderstanding, the real understanding, and how we're supposed to understand it. So there is a lot of incredible amount of research that is done on things which were spontaneously written and obviously beautifully crafted in terms of writing, and even if rudimentary engraved, there were at least spread around so other pianists can learn them. After all, there was no recordings, there was no capacity to hear the performing of Beethoven if ever it was to be the template for others. After all, he wrote it, doesn't mean he's the best player of it, but we would think by the search of authenticity that cannot not be. But we learned with those who did leave us recordings that being the composer is not per se the only best source for it. In a way, it's in the eye of the beholder. Some performers love it, understand it, and serve it, and bring it to a different level than it was intended, perhaps, with the composer. After all, that's also the beauty of the exchange between the composer and the interpreter as a completing factor, bringing alive the codified text. And of course, certain things are defined and certain things remain beautifully in an innuendo zone, let's put it this way. I like the innuendo zone to be what gives us the room for our own imagination. It's not just the A section, it's also the other sections, the B, the C, the whatever you want to call it, the relative minor complaint. Perhaps it's not a complaint, but I hear it as a lament. Or even more so as some kind of operatic situation where there is a pleading, oh please. And then you had earlier the section where you went to the dominant with the trill in the first violin and in the cello, and the other middle parts, the accompaniment. So you had already these two different elements, and every time we return to the main element. No matter how much it's codified, no matter how much it's structured, organized, and in a way giving us very little room for our own expression within its or his, to become ours, to not steal it from him, obviously, because that would be very not right and anyway very primitive. What I mean is, when we restate it with our own voice, to become something that means today, for the listener of today, with the performer of today. It becomes present, real, now, not a museum past piece reconstructed for today or rebuilt. It's not that. It's alive with the same expression of intensity and hope and minor and major and trills and pizzicato or staccato and legato and the singing and the quartet and the four voices. I mean, there is something intemporal, while of course it's classical. I think any performer makes the piece their own, meaning they have a sense of appropriation of the piece for the way they receive it, and they practice in order to transmit it either to the audience of discoverers who just are there to discover it, or professionals who are there to discern if you do it right, which is harder. So you do competition, juries, auditions for different purposes in your professional life, but it is the same piece for the discovering amateur or for the knowledgeable professional. And we have to be convincing in both cases, with a flow, with a tempo, with a sense of involvement and respect for the text. But not only recitation that seems to be polite but not really involved, because we don't seem to be connecting to whatever it's supposed to be saying, or at least what we should think that it tells us, even if it can vary from one person to another. So it creates a sense of meaning. It's prettiful but meaningful. That's Beethoven, for sure.